From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Our lineup of distinguished authors will discuss a whole range of topics related to life in the 21st century. And I want to just mention these authors because it's such a distinguished lineup. It's just really, for the National Book Festival, an embarrassment of riches. We have Angela J. Davis. Yes. Keeanga Yamada Taylor. Jabari Asim, who is quickly finishing his email before the talk. Just kidding. Anne-Marie Slaughter, Alejandro Danois, James McBride, Diane Rehm, Susan Jacoby, and Jeffrey Toobin. So they're all going to be appearing here today, and I hope you will get to see them. Also, I want to make special notice of one author, Joanne Jenkins, who is the current CEO of AARP and a former senior manager at the Library of Congress. Joanne and AARP are longtime supporters of the National Book Festival, and I really want to extend my gratitude to her and AARP for their continued support. I think she'll enjoy her talk about disruptive aging. I've turned 63 in just a couple more months, and I've heard Joanne speak, and a lot of the things she was talking about really rang true for me. So I hope you get to see her. But it's now my pleasure to tell you about today's program, which is a panel discussion about contemporary issues in African American lives. It is my pleasure to introduce the first of three panelists for this discussion, Jabari Asim, who is an author, poet, playwright, and associate professor of writing, literature, and publishing at Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts, where he directs the MFA Creative Writing Program. He is also the executive editor of The Crisis. Please welcome Jabari Asim and our panelists today, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this discussion. As Robert says, the first to take place today on the Contemporary Life stage here at the National Book Festival. And it's my great privilege to be in conversation with two insightful authors whose work has obvious relevance to many of the events taking place in the country at this time. We convene following the police killings of Terrence Crutcher and Keith Lamont Todd, which follows so many similar deaths of women and men of color across the nation. They are events that have prompted many to not only question the justice system, but also, in the words of the great Fannie Lou Hamer, to question America. I'll keep the introduction short because you can read more in the festival brochure. But with me is Angela J. Davis, professor of law at American University's Washington College of Law, and the author of Arbitrary Justice, The Power of the American Prosecutor. She's an expert in criminal law and procedure and researches prosecutorial power and racism in the criminal justice system. Her forthcoming book, Policing the Black Man, will be available in Pantheon next year. We are joined by Keeanga Yamada Taylor, an assistant professor in Princeton University's Center for African American Studies. Her research often examines race and public policy. Her book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, is an examination of history, politics, and the development of the social movement Black Lives Matter in response to police violence in the United States. We're going to talk a little bit among ourselves before welcoming questions from the audience later in the program. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll dive right in. Keeanga, thank you for your book. There was an aha moment for me on nearly every page, especially when you encouraged me to think about connections between local developments and national movements, and to think about contemporary moments within the context of a much longer historical struggle. You've written that when your publisher first encouraged you to write this book, you declined. I'm very glad that you eventually agreed, but I'm curious why you hesitated at first.
Oh, there were probably two main reasons. One is I had just moved across the country from Chicago to Philadelphia. I teach at Princeton University, and you know, it's a fairly significant transition for me, and I felt like I was trying to get acclimated to a new place, a new situation, and didn't have time to write a book, especially because I was supposed to be writing another book, the book that I'm writing now. And then the second one is probably more relevant, which is that it's difficult to write about something that is unfolding, that you're in the midst of, to essentially write about a moving target. And so my reluctance was because things seemed to be changing so rapidly, because we had already gone from a local movement tightly wound to events in Ferguson from August 2014 until December. And in December of 2014, I don't know if people will remember, we really went from a locally focused struggle to have a police officer indicted in Ferguson to a national movement that was sort of propelled by then the killing of young Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Tanisha Anderson in Cleveland, I think a couple of weeks before Tamir Rice was killed, and then Eric Garner, who hundreds of thousands of people had seen choked to death by New York City police officers the month before Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson. The officer who ultimately killed Eric Garner was also not indicted somewhere at the beginning of December. And so it all of a sudden turned into a national phenomenon with marches and demonstrations across the country. And so I had so many things in my head that I was thinking about, that I wanted to say, that I essentially took a weekend to decide if I could actually write the book. And I sat down at a coffee shop, and I think I wrote 8,000 or 9,000 words in 4 or 5 hours, all of which I could use. And so I was like, I have things to say. I can write this book. And so I did.
No, we're glad you did. Angela, you served many years as a public defender. How much did that direct experience figure into this book, as well as the book you're working on, Policing the Black Man? And I also wondered if you might comment on what Keeanga talked about, trying to almost keep pace with the headlines as you work on something like that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, my years at the DC Public Defender Service had everything to do with that book, because I worked at the DC Public Defender Service for 12 years. And one of the things there were a lot of things that troubled me, because, you know, it's all about the criminal justice system and its flaws. But the thing that troubled me the most was this incredible power and discretion that prosecutors had. I saw them doing all kinds of things that were, if they didn't qualify as prosecutorial misconduct, they were unfair. They created results that were simply unfair. People, similarly situated people who committed the same crimes allegedly, being treated differently, and the difference seemed to be race and or class. And they weren't held accountable for it, and didn't seem to be a mechanism for holding them accountable. And that didn't seem right. We're in a democracy, right? We hold those accountable to whom we grant power, and these were the most powerful individuals in the criminal justice system. And I just thought, how can this be? So when I did join the academy, I started researching it, writing articles, and then finally thought, I got more to say about this, you know, and wanted to do this book. So it had every influence on me. And as far as I can so relate to what Keeanga is saying about trying to keep up with the headlines in terms of the book I'm working on now, which is an anthology. I have a number of contributing editors, but it's about policing the black man. And of course, it came out of these killings of unarmed black men and women throughout the country. And, you know, we'll never finish writing that book, it seems, because every single day there's another killing, and it's just unfathomable.
So your description of there being different punishments for different types of defendants makes me think about your book in which you use the phrase double standard of justice, in which you deliberately echoed the Kerner Commission's language. This notion of a double standard of justice challenges our tendency to think of law and order as something inherently good or designed in our best interest. Could you tell us more about the meaning of double standard of justice as you see it?
Sure. I think the main thing that I wanted to, well, there were two things I wanted to draw attention to. One is I used the phrase from the Kerner Commission, which if people don't know, in the aftermath of the uprisings in the 1960s, from 1963 in Birmingham to the rebellions after the assassination of Martin Luther King in April of 1968. Prior to the King uprisings, Lyndon Johnson had paneled a commission to investigate the causes of the rebellions, which were fairly significant, that involved over 500,000 African Americans in more than 200 cities in the United States. And so they came up with a list of several factors that contributed to these uprisings, and one of them had to do with police brutality. And they referred to the double standard of justice, meaning essentially that there appears to be one standard of justice for one group of people in the United States, and then a separate standard for African Americans in particular, though you could talk about the ways in which non-white people seem to get treated differently consistently throughout the American criminal justice system. And so some of this involved just looking at disparities. You look at the number of black people in the U.S., which is somewhere between 12 and 13% of the population, and yet black people make up almost half of the people in prison, almost half of the people on death row. In every sort of category that you go through the criminal justice system, there is a grotesque overrepresentation of black people in the criminal justice system. And so I wanted to draw attention to that for obvious reasons in the context of the emergence of this Black Lives Matter movement, and investigate why that is. Why is there this almost unbroken continuity of racial discriminatory approaches to policing from the time of emancipation for African Americans to the current moment? And so there are many things that I say about that which calls into question the entire institution of policing as to whether or not it's actually about policing and ending crime, or whether or not it's about something else that has absolutely nothing to do with crime. And just, as one example of that, you look at a city like Chicago, which is obviously struggling quite a bit with violence and crime that has been highlighted in the mass media. But if you just look at two things that have transpired in the last 3 months in Chicago, they have fired 1,000 teachers, and 2 days ago, Rahm Emanuel pledged to hire 1,000 police officers. When it came to teachers, we were told that, there's a budget crisis, we can't afford this, put 40 kids in a classroom, do whatever you have to do to make the situation work. When it comes to hiring police officers, which will cost $134 million, the mayor has said that he will turn over every stone to come up with the money necessary to hire the police. And so we have to put those two realities together. And when they don't fit together, we have to ask, is policing really about protecting and preserving law and order, or is it about something else? And what is it, the something else that I think is important to talk about, that gets at what is meant by there being two standards of justice in the country.
Related to that, Angela, the Black Lives Matter movement has brought attention to the role of prosecutors in some high-profile cases, so the behavior of prosecutors has sort of entered the public conversation in a way that it hasn't often. We talk about Robert McCulloch following the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Anita Alvarez, who's now out of office, but following the killing of Laquan McDonald in Chicago, and Marilyn Mosby following the killings of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. Now, your book addresses, among other things, what you call discretionary decision-making on the part of prosecutors. Can you tell us something about that within the context of the movement for Black Lives?
Sure. So that's one of the things that I've noted that I found so interesting. I mean, what I've been trying to do is make people pay attention to prosecutors. I mean, of course we need to pay attention to cops, and there's been a lot of attention paid to them. Unfortunately, things have not gotten better. They seem to be getting worse. But very few people pay attention to the prosecutor, right? And they are the most powerful individuals in our criminal justice system. The cop can stop a person on the street, can arrest them, can harass them, and that's awful. But they can only bring the person to the courthouse door. They do not make the decision about whether that person stays in the system. The prosecutor does. Prosecutor and the prosecutor alone decides whether to charge the person. They don't have to charge them if they don't want to. We know that now when we see them not charging cops. They decide what to charge the person with. And so that discretion, and it's totally up to their discretion to do so, them and them alone. That is an incredible power that prosecutors have. And I don't think people have been paying too much attention to it, but one of the things that has happened since all of these killings of unarmed black men have come to light, and of course, you're right, Kenya, they've been going on since slavery, but we didn't have cell phone cameras back then, so no one believed that what happened happened, and now we see it happening. But now people are starting to pay attention because they're thinking, well, wait a minute, why? I just saw this cop murder this man with my eyes. I saw Eric Garner being choked to death with my two eyes, and the prosecutor did not charge the cop. And so now people are paying attention to this powerful person, the prosecutor, and they need to pay attention because most of the prosecutors, the vast majority of them on the state and local level, are elected officials. And their names are on the ballot, folks. And people don't pay attention to those races. A lot of the time, most of the times they run unopposed, but even when they do run against other people, they don't talk about what they do behind closed doors. Their charging decisions, their plea bargaining decisions, most people aren't even familiar with those terms. They run on, I'm tough on crime, and their opponent says, I'm tougher on crime, and that's all they say about what they do. But now people are starting to pay attention to what they do and starting to pay attention to races. And one last thing I'll say before you move on is Anita Alvarez is a prime example. So Anita Alvarez was the prosecutor in Chicago, and people didn't really pay attention to what she was doing. But then when Laquan McDonald was killed, and there was a videotape that was not released, and she sat on that indictment, didn't move forward, and it wasn't until a judge ordered the release of that videotape and we could see what actually happened that she then decided to charge that cop. I firmly believe she never would have if that videotape hadn't come out. The interesting thing about her, though, is that when that happened, the media started to investigate her background. And as it turns out, she was one of the worst prosecutors ever because she had engaged in tremendous amounts of prosecutorial misconduct throughout her tenure as a prosecutor. No one knew about that. No one was paying attention to it. And of course, she was voted out because people started paying attention, and now Kim Foxx is the prosecutor. And then finally, Marilyn Mosby, I mean, we see the different way that she came in there and she brought those indictments in the Freddie Gray case. But we see what happened, right? No convictions. Absolutely no convictions. I'm not saying that's her fault, but they chose not to have a jury trial, and of course, they were acquitted. I will say this, in terms of what prosecutors do, we need to pay attention not only to whether they're indicting cops, that's so important. We need to pay attention to what are they doing every day with the lives of black and brown people who they are charging. They're not charging cops, but they are steadily charging black and brown people over petty things. And I will say, including my sister Marilyn Mosby, Baltimore has some of the most terrible racial disparities in the country. And so I would like to talk to her about maybe, I'm glad she moved on those cops, but Why are so many black and brown people being locked up, being charged in Baltimore over petty things and locked up? She has the power to change that, and I hope that she will.
I do think her movement on that, though, is indicative about the moment, because in my opinion, the only reason why she moved on that is because there was an uprising in Baltimore, and the political establishment had to do something to retain some level of legitimacy. Because I think that you can have a spectrum for where people fall who are prosecutors on it. So you have draconian law and order prosecutors, someone like Anita Alvarez and that woman in Florida, Angela,
you shared name, I'm ashamed to say. Corey.
Yes. Okay, so you have that on one end of the spectrum, and then people will point to Marilyn Mosley on the other end of the spectrum. But what gets lost in that, I think, is what is the job of the prosecutor, which is to prosecute people. And so for Mosley in Baltimore, even though she was compelled, I think, because of the uprising, to press charges against the 6 police officers in Baltimore, 3 weeks before Freddie Gray was picked up by the police, she individually put out a memo that basically said she wanted more eyes and hands on deck on the corner that Freddie Gray was picked up on, which police interpreted, or at least they said they interpreted as a direct order to produce more arrests. And this is part of the politicization of policing and law and order in cities in the first place, which is so much of it is driven by arrest rates. How many people can you arrest, which becomes political fodder as proof that you're being tough on crime, and using that to determine whether the crime rate is rising or falling in a very political way, not a way that is substantive in terms of, are we transforming the quality of people's lives in this community by actually ending crime through the creation of good jobs, good schools, and creating some sense of community. Not that, but tracking the rise and fall of arrest rates as a way to turn into a campaign slogan that you are either tough on crime or your opponent isn't as tough as you are. And so there's a whole logic that is generated among elected officials, including prosecutors, that has nothing to do with actually improving the neighborhoods and communities that people live in, but is all about how you can turn these situations into political capital, and it's a problem.
And related to that, there doesn't appear to be, since the spotlight, the glare of the spotlight tends to move away from the prosecutor, except for during electoral campaigns. There doesn't seem to be much transparency in terms of how they operate. And so 2 factors there. Is the only way to discipline prosecutors by voting them out of office? And you've mentioned in your book the role of bar associations and agencies within the profession that ostensibly govern or somehow overlook these processes. What can we do? Is voting them out the only recourse, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah. So let me just stress something you said about transparency. There's no transparency, right? So the most important decisions they make are the charging decision and the plea bargaining decision. By the way, people think, there are all these trials going on because they're watching Law and Order on TV. There are not a lot of trials going on. 95% of all criminal cases are resolved by way of a guilty plea. 95%. It's higher in some jurisdictions, right? That's a whole other issue. But they control that too. They control the plea bargaining. They control who gets a plea, what the plea is, whether the person's going to be charged, whether they're not. There are a lot of people who are committing crimes who are not being charged at all. We don't know that because those decisions are made behind closed doors. We find that out when the media investigates a certain case and then, oh, now we know. But there's no way for us to know that. That's so undemocratic, right? I mean, that's not what democracy is supposed to be about, right? So I just want to stress that point first and foremost. What can we do about it? So elections, as I said before, most state and local prosecutors are elected officials. The problem is that oftentimes when you go to vote, there's often one name there because people don't challenge prosecutors. Some of them serve for decades. There's no term limits. And it's hard, as we know, to run for office because it requires money. So Bob McCullough, for example, in Ferguson, there was a black woman who actually challenged him, and she got nowhere. She didn't have the backing. He was a powerful incumbent, in terms of the population there of African Americans. They're in the minority in that particular county. So it's hard to vote them out, but it can happen. See Kim Fox, who got out. And it's interesting because I think Anita Alvarez was unseated in Chicago, I think largely because of the spotlight, national spotlight coming on her. Similarly to the prosecutor in Staten Island who failed to prosecute the cop who killed Eric Garner. He was voted out, and largely people think because of the spotlight. So it's interesting how that's had an impact. But folks, we need to pay attention and vote. And the thing to do is question your prosecutors. Ask them questions when these things happen. Call them up. They're elected officials just like everybody else. They have to be elected. You mentioned bar association. So another way to deal with prosecutors who are misbehaving and engaging in misconduct is bar counsel. So people may remember the Duke lacrosse case some years ago. The prosecutor there, Mike Nifong, was disbarred because of what happened in that case and his failure to turn over exculpatory evidence. But you know who the defendants were? They were wealthy white lacrosse players who could afford fancy lawyers, who were able to investigate and comb through all of that DNA complicated evidence and discover that, the prosecutor didn't turn this over, and so therefore we're going to refer him to bar counsel. So bar counsel is a body in every state which disciplines lawyers when they violate the rules of professional conduct. And they can disbar them, they can suspend them, and so on. Prosecutors almost never, ever, ever disbarred for anything. They're rarely referred. Mike Nifong was, in fact, the first prosecutor I was aware of who was disbarred for his failure to turn over exculpatory evidence, which is a violation of the rules. I can't tell you the number of cases I had as a public defender where prosecutors failed to turn over exculpatory evidence. There are many high-profile cases where people have gone to death row because prosecutors have failed to turn that over. Were those prosecutors disbarred? No. Were they even referred to bar counsel? No. Nothing happened to them. Many of them went on to become judges, went on to become greater things. But the Nifong, the lacrosse players had the power, they had the stature, and they didn't even spend a day in jail. Nothing happened to them, yet that prosecutor was disbarred. It just blew my mind because I was like, that's wild. Can I think of the cases of people who, like I said, almost died because of something a prosecutor did, and those prosecutors did not suffer anything. I am writing, in fact, just wrote an article called The Prosecutor's Ethical Duty to End Mass Incarceration, which I know sounds crazy, but I think they have an ethical duty to end mass incarceration. And I use them, thank you. Because we have a crisis, we have 2.2 million people in prisons and jails, disproportionately black and brown people, it's unfair. And they have the power to stop that. They have the power to end it in many different ways. And I use the rules, and there are rules that talk about their ethical duty to be ministers of justice and to administer justice. This is not justice what they're doing here. It's not. So I make the argument that they have that ethical duty. The problem with the rules, though, Jabari, is that the rules that apply to prosecutors are so weak, right? So there's so many things prosecutors do that I think are unfair and unethical that are not under the rules. So we need to change the rules, and we need to use the rules that we have to refer them to bar. Anybody can refer someone to bar counsel, by the way. It doesn't have to be a lawyer if they are aware of misconduct. The problem is what you said, and I'll stop here, before, lack of transparency. Yeah. To discover what they're doing in the first place, right, is difficult. So you can't refer them if you don't know about the dirt that they're doing. So, I think that's the problem.
It is the double standard of justice.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
King, I wanted to return to a point you made about that corner on which Freddie Gray was arrested, and he initially attracted the attention of the police by making eye contact.
Yes.
And that made me think of a phrase. You have a number of phrases that resonated with me in your book. One of them you talked about criminalization creep, in which the notion of what is criminal behavior continues to expand so that more and more people are caught in the net. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. It's amazing that in a country that purports to be for small government, liberty, not intrusive, state, that if you look at the sort of growing lists of actions that are becoming crimes, it's a complete affront to that logic. So that in many cities now, it's a crime to sit on the sidewalk. It's a crime to sleep in your car. It's a crime to sleep outside in public in general. It's a crime to ask for money, to beg for money. And there's a growing list of what may perhaps be construed as a nuisance have been transformed into criminal behavior. And the problem with this is this approach to the law is manifest. I mean, there's the constant invitation for engagement with the police, which then creates an entire broader whirlwind of problems as a result. Because one of the things that we're finding now, almost directly as a result of the uprising in Ferguson, is the way in which the police, in unison with city government and often in unison with prosecutors, almost act as a kleptocracy, meaning that they've turned into official policy stealing, essentially, from poor and working class people, partly as a way to fill the coffers of municipalities. In Ferguson, there was a direct relationship, which was almost in order for the police to draw a paycheck, they had to rely on fining and feeing the black population of the city. And so you end up with this huge portion of the population in Ferguson with outstanding warrants based on unpaid fees for traffic violations, which makes no sense. And so that is part of the problem with the sort of growing criminalization of non-criminal offenses and the way that it draws people into the criminal justice system through an assortment of fines and fees that if people can't pay, that then turn into criminal offenses that people are actually are arrested for. And so not only are the police not attending to crime, but they're also deepening poverty. They're also raising the propensity for crime in the communities that they are targeting for this. And this, I think, has to become part of a larger critique of the movement in terms of targeting this. I think one of the things that we have to focus on in the movement is this issue of decriminalization, of actually trying to undo the criminalization of these non-criminal offenses for all of the complications that come as a result of it.
That leads to a follow-up for both of you, but while you were talking, I also remember that you mentioned in the book that there's one neighboring municipality of Ferguson that actually rigged the traffic light so that police could turn it red while cars were in the middle of the intersection.
This was a fundraising technique, and it's not just some little podunk, that we remember from the Dukes of Hazzard, all these tricks to, get people to run a red light or run a stop sign so you can give a ticket. In Chicago, in the second or third largest city in the United States, when they went through implementing, I think there are more red light cameras in Chicago than any other city in the country. Not only did they put red light cameras everywhere, where if you run a red light, it's an automatic $100 fine. If you don't pay it within, I think, 60 days, it doubles. If you don't pay it within another 30 days, it triples. And so you can see how immediately this is something that ensnares working class and poor people, but they shortened the yellow light. They shortened it so that to increase the likelihood that people would be, then running a red light. So not only are they putting people's lives at risk by shortening the red light and, compelling people to speed through it, but it's an actual fundraising scheme by the city on the backs of the people who can least afford it. And so the idea that elected officials would be using the police as a way to bridge financial gaps in the city is so problematic on so many levels. Not only is this not what we are told police are supposed to do. This has nothing to do with fighting crime, not even in the least. But it also creates an antagonism in terms of where the police are located, who it is that they are trying to ticket, who it is that can least afford to be indebted over, parking tickets and red light tickets and that sort of thing.
Okay, my follow-up, I'm going to start with you, Angela, but I'm going to start with a quote from Kianga. She wrote, you've written that historically the vast majority of police in the United States were white, uneducated, working class, and completely consumed with racism. And that made me think of the FBI's own report about the infiltration of white supremacists into police departments around the country. And Colin Kaepernick has recently contended that in some cities, cosmetologists require more training than police. Now, I'm noting all of this during a time when the nation's largest police union has endorsed Donald Trump's campaign for president. Within that context, it becomes hard to regard community policing and restoring trust with anything other than skepticism. Is reform too gentle a concept here? Should we be thinking of something more extensive?
For police, you're talking about?
Yeah.
I think yes. I mean, the idea of policing has not been my focus in terms of coming up with things that we should do. But I will say, in other words, that's not my expertise about what should we do rather than the reform we're doing now. But it's clear that whatever this reform is that we're doing now isn't working. So community policing means so many different things in so many different areas. It certainly is not anything that has stopped or, in my opinion, even reduced the abuse that police, rain down on communities of color. I mean, clearly that it has not changed that at all. So if it is going to be continuing reform, it has to look like something very different than what it is now. So we know the president had this task force on 21st century policing. My good friend Tracy Mears is on that task force. Brian Stevenson is on it. They're great people who are on that task force. I mean, I just think, and I'm, I hope that there's going to be some change as a result of that. I think the problem is that, who makes police do what they do, right? It gets back to that. Like, the president can have this task force, but he actually has no direct power over local police departments. He cannot make them do anything. The Justice Department can't make them do it unless they file a lawsuit and do the consent decrees. And I think those things are important. I think that report that came out of Ferguson as a result of the Justice Department's investigation was incredibly important. They just did a similar report in Baltimore. Those things are incredibly important. But in terms of directly making police officers behave differently, I think it has to be I don't even know how it's going to be done, but there has to be a totally different mindset and change about what police officers are supposed to be doing. I mean, you're right. There's no training required for them to come in. The background, I don't know what kind of background checks they're doing. There's no psychological testing done on a regular basis. I think let's put it this way. It varies from city to city. Some do none, some do some. They don't do them regularly. So, we see the kind of people who end up on police forces and what they're doing to people. Many of them come in with this militaristic idea of they're policing, they're there to, control those communities, not to serve them. I mean, that's the mindset of so many of them. And so how we change this nationally, I don't know, because the way governance works, the president can't come in and fire all the police. He doesn't have the power to do that. So much of it is up to these individual state and local entities. That's why I tell people, Most police chiefs are appointed by the mayor. I mean, all politics is local, and sometimes the most important politics is local, right? Because your police chief most likely is appointed by your mayor. And so you decide who that mayor is, and when you vote, you need to be asking your mayor, who's going to be the police chief? I want a police chief who's not going to be out here, you know, hiring police officers that are going to be killing people for no reason. So it comes right down to that, you know, to the basic sort of democratic tenets that we have. We need to get involved in our local, in politics, and ways to make that change, because there's no magic bullet that's going to change this from around the country, in my opinion. If there is, I hope there is, but I don't know of one, you know. I think it's that hard work of getting in there and individually in your communities, becoming active in your communities and saying you're not going to have this in your community. And that involves getting on the street, it involves demonstrating, but it also involves voting and being politically active.
I'm going to ask that if you want Kianga's response to that, buy her
I'm
book.
sorry, I
That's
want
okay.
her response, so I talk
Can
too
I
long.
just say really
Yes,
quickly?
please. But I also want to encourage people, if you have questions, you can line up at the microphone. That was my last question. If you have a question or comment after Kianga's response, please.
I will just say really quickly, because I do want to hear from, I know we all want to hear from the audience, that one of the things I write in my book is that there has been no golden age of policing that we can point to say, here is a model of what good policing community relationships look like. And I think that's important, because we often hear politicians say, oh, we have to rebuild trust, you know, between the police and the community. And it's like, what are you talking about? Because to rebuild trust means that at some point there was trust to have been established in the first place. And so at every period you look at, 1992, the Los Angeles uprising, which in many ways was the sort of first videotaped beating, the police are exonerated. You look at the 1960s, that Kerner Commission that I talked about earlier listed the top 3 reasons why there were these rebellions, successive rebellions in hundreds of cities across the United States over that 5-year period. Poverty and unemployment, substandard housing, police brutality. 1951, a contingent of activists in the United States went to present a petition to the United States. They called themselves We Charge Genocide. It was all about police violence and abuse. The first modern urban uprising in the United States involving a predominantly black population, Harlem, 1935. Why? The police killed a 15-year-old boy in, outside of a shop in the neighborhood. And so there is no point at which we can talk about good policing as a model, which for me raises all sorts of questions about the institution of policing itself and whether it is actually set up and exists in a way to do what we are constantly told that it is supposed to do.
We have a number of people and very little time to accommodate them. Let's start over here, and then we'll alternate from microphone to microphone.
And we'll be quick.
Hello? Okay. Thank you both for this very important discussion. And as a young attorney, I'm particularly glad that you have talked so much about prosecutorial discretion and the role that plays in the criminal justice system. And you mentioned so much about the role of voting in local elections, yet we have so many state laws that disenfranchise many black and brown people, particularly those who were brought into the criminal justice system under perhaps questionable circumstances and have now lost their right to vote. Can you comment on how that particular phenomena, if you will, dovetails with this entire discussion that you've had so far? Thank you.
So I'm going to put my friend Nicole Porter on the spot. Raise your hand, Nicole. Raise your hand. Higher. Nicole is at the Sentencing Project, which is a wonderful organization here in the District of Columbia. And The Sentencing Project does great work around felony disenfranchisement. And in fact, there are many states where people actually do have the right to vote, even if they have a felony conviction. And there's a lot of information on their website about that. So I think, you know, that is a huge problem, the fact that so many people have lost their right to vote as a result of that. But there are changes going on in many states around that, and there's a lot of action around changing that, including right here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, although what the governor did there is being challenged. But I think that people may have the right to vote if they have a conviction. They may still have the right to vote, and they need to research that to find out. So I'm going to direct folks to the Sentencing Project's website and go to Nicole afterwards, and she'll tell you all about that. But I think that's a great point. So many people have lost their right to vote, but many people have their right and they aren't using it. And so I'm encouraging those who do to do so.
I'm from North Carolina, and as you know, we have a law that's going in the books October 1st to keep police films out of public view. And I was wondering if other states have that law, if you think other states will adopt it, and is there any basis which that could get off the books?
Interestingly, Missouri, I believe, is the only other state right now that has passed the law that basically says the body camera footage cannot be released, will not be released to the public unless it is up to the discretion, I believe, of either the police or a judge, which of course undermines the entire point of the transparency that was intended with that legislation in the first place. I absolutely think that this has the potential to be a kind of copycat in other states, which are much more concerned with what they believe to be protecting the legitimacy of their police forces than providing transparency to what is still a public institution. People forget when there is a reluctance to release the names of police officers who kill civilians, releasing footage from body cameras. These are public institutions. That means that they should be under the most intense scrutiny of the public. And so that is one of the things that we have to keep in the forefront of our protest. Is not, this isn't a moral question. This is about public servants having to answer to the taxpayers who provide their salaries in the first place.
Hi, my name is Carlos. Thank you for having this conversation. I just wanted to make a comment to draw parallels. I'm a public school teacher, or worked for 7 years, and the parallels with schools. And the common variable is control. So unfortunately, law enforcement control rather than protects. In schools, I saw a lot of times that it's control rather than educate. So it's that common variable, and how do we change that culture from a very start, right, of seeing minorities as people who need to get educated versus controlled. And as a result, don't grow up thinking that, they are a problem for law enforcement, and those students who were with them as cops see them as someone to control versus to protect. So just wanted to make that comment because those parallels just came to mind as I heard the discussion. But thank you again for the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the conversation. My question is for Professor Davis. As you know, being a public defender service lawyer, our prosecutors mostly are U.S. attorneys who, obviously the U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia is appointed and is not elected. And similarly, all of our judges in D.C. Superior Court are appointed by the president. So I know you mentioned bar council complaints, and I think that that's a crucial way to try to help shine some light on prosecutorial conduct. But specifically for those of us who are district citizens here, what can we do to try to hold both our judges and our prosecutors accountable?
So, did you say you're a public defender here in D.C.?
No, I said you're a public defender.
Yes,
Attorney, but not a public defender.
So D.C. is that strange animal out of it all because it's not a state, right? And so the U.S. attorney, which is a federal prosecutor. Every state has a U.S. attorney, has one or more U.S. attorneys. They prosecute in federal court, but in D.C., the U.S. attorney prosecutes both the local crimes and the federal crimes. So you can't vote. Right. So they're appointed. So you can't vote in the U.S. attorney because they're federal. So what do? Well, you know, I always talk about how voting is the mechanism of accountability for prosecutors. But it doesn't work because there's no transparency. Even when there's voting, it's hard to pick a good person. It's even worse when it's a federal prosecutor. Technically, the way you do it is you weigh in when that prosecutor is nominated, the person's nominated to be U.S. attorney, then you are supposed to write, you know, if you had a senator, which D.C. doesn't really have one, but you weigh in that way, right? You call Eleanor Holmes Norton or whoever and you say, you know, I don't think this person should be the prosecutor or the U.S. attorney. The problem is the same as it is everywhere else. Because you don't know what that person has been doing as a prosecutor because it's done behind closed doors, it's not a perfect system. When I tell people to go vote, I'm not saying that's the magic wand that's going to solve everything. It's the mechanism in the system that we have. As far as judges are concerned, I don't think necessarily the voting in elected judges is a good idea either, right? Because that happens a lot in the South. In fact, in a lot of the death penalty states, you have judges running for office who are actually running on, I will make sure we get more death penalty cases going through than others that are running on that. So a lot of times, you know, when it comes to judges who have a very different function from prosecutors, having elected judges is not necessarily the answer either, but thank you for your question. You raise a good point.
Oh, hi, I'm currently a high school student, a senior at the Landon School for Boys, and I'm president of the MSA and BSU there. And I was wondering, what is your stance on reparations for African Americans in the United States? Do you think it would be beneficial or would reduce the catalyst on ongoing political movements like Black Lives Matter? And by reparations, I don't entirely mean economical.
I mean, I'm certainly for reparations for African Americans because I think that we see the ways that legal racism and discrimination in particular, not just in slavery, but very much in the 20th century, continues to impact and shape Black realities. I think that the author, Ta-Nehisi Coates, did us all a great favor by connecting the struggle around reparations, not just to the issue of slavery, but to the contemporary ways that racial discrimination constrains Black life, particularly by looking at the role of government in particular in legislating discriminatory practices around housing and access to housing and redlining. And in a country where so much personal wealth is vested in access to home ownership, in the way that the federal government in particular worked to exclude Black people from that enterprise has continued to have implications over generations in a way that people are often able to obscure the kind of lineages that exist between slavery and who would be the direct beneficiary today, and I didn't own a slave, and all of that. Instead of having that debate, let's talk about how throughout the course of the 20th century, public policy has actively undermined Black life chances, Black quality of life. And so in that context, I'm very much for reparations. I'm for checks. I'm for public policy programs. I'm for all sorts of the creations of all sorts of programs and institutions that can substantively improve the quality of Black life in this country.
I'm told we have 2 minutes left. So we probably have time for one more question.
Thank you. I'm really excited that I get to ask this question, and I'm also really excited to be here the same week that Kianga is. I'm here from Standing Rock, North Dakota. Anyways, I was wondering, Kianga, thank you. I was wondering if you could speak on white supremacism inherently built into our institutions and your perspective on how we can achieve liberation when we live in a wealthy society built on land theft and genocide of Native Americans, the enslavement and exploitation of free labor of Africans, and the continued oppression of the entire working class.
In 2 minutes.
Sorry, I was really hoping it'd be last two.
The one thing I'll say about that, and thank you for the question, is, I think we're in the season where everyone talks about the importance of voting and the supremacy of voting and all that, and that's fine and well. But the reality is, in my opinion, that the greatest substantive changes that have happened for poor, oppressed, and working class people in this country have come as a result of struggle, and have come as a result of movements. And so we have to have the perspective of no matter who is in the White House, because, Donald Trump is a menacing, bigoted billionaire, but then a lot of what we are talking about in terms of mass incarceration, in terms of the racialization of black people negatively, the architecture was put in place 20 years ago. It was put in place a long time, but the Clinton administration in the 1990s, which gave us the crime bill in 1994, which gave us super predators, and which ended welfare 20 years ago on the premise of a racist contention that black people were somehow feeding off the system unequally or unfairly, it means that both parties are complicit in what is happening to poor and working people. And so how we overcome that depends on the strength of our organizing and our movements. And so the Black Lives Matter have to connect up with the undocumented movement, have to connect up with Arabs and Muslims in the movement against Islamophobia, have to connect up with the brothers and sisters fighting the pipeline in South Dakota and every other places around this country to build a larger, more united movement. And that's how we, as ordinary people, advance our cause.
I have to say one thing. I agree with everything that King has said, but please don't stay home on November 8th, and please come out and vote, and don't let Donald Trump become the president of the United States. I'm sorry, I had to say that. Thank you.
We are over our allotted time. Thank you all very much. Thank you. And thanks to our panelists.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.